All right. So today we're getting like the nuts and bolts of what we need to be able to finish that next project. So our next project is modifying data in a database. So today we're getting started with that. We're not getting to the modifying part. We're just going to be seeing how can we use VBA to read data in from a database. But let's have a little bit of a review on what relational database management is. I think I've got this. I've got this here. So managing data the idea behind a database management system is to say, listen, we've got some data that we need to be able to manage. And that's like the central thing. And then we have some software whose responsibility is to protect the data. It's called a database engine. It's in charge of data security, making sure that only the people that are supposed to have access to the data have access to the data. So this often means that the engine is going to encrypt the data on the disk as well, so that if someone tries to get at the data by bypassing the engine, they won't be able to do it. It's going to establish all kinds of permissions, and so that as people are logged in, there's allowed to see some data and not allowed to see other data. In charge of data integrity, which means if we say, oh, we're recording an order and this order was made by customer number 27, that there really is a customer number 27. To make sure that we say this is order number 1,222, there's only one order number 1,222, so we can keep everything straight. So that's in data integrity. It's in charge of data recovery. If it's right in the middle of updating some data and there's someone kicks the power cord out or some kind of catastrophic failure, or even the disk, dies, the disk drives die. Yeah. How many of you ever had a disk drive fail, a hard disk fail? Any of you ever had a hard disk fail? So one of you live blessed lives. Anyway, that happens from time to time. So it's got to say, hey, even if we've had a hard disk failure, we want to be able to recover. When the system comes back online, it's got to be able to realize, there's a problem here. We got to be able to recover from that problem. Setting up the data definition, data manipulation, changing the data that's in there, but the engine spends most of its time just executing queries. So, give me a list of all customers who have purchased a printer in the last 5 months that have not also purchased ink to go with that printer. We're going to reach out to those folks and say, we know exactly what kind of printer you have because you just bought one, and we're going to tell you that we've got a sale on the kind of ink that you need, see if we can get you to buy some ink from us. So that's what it does, running queries. But the engine is non-visual software, which means people don't interact with it. People interact with software that interacts with the engine. This is, who can name anyone in this picture? Just give me a name of one of these characters. Go ahead. Oh, you got two of them. Yeah, so you're a Star Trek fan. So here's Montgomery Scott, who's the chief engineer on the Enterprise, and here's, who's his name again? Dr. McCoy, McCoy, who's the ship's doctor on the Enterprise. This is from a movie that I think was released in 1987, called Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. How many of you have seen it? Oh, some of you have seen it. I saw this for the first time, it was released while I was on my mission. So I saw it for the first time, in the Varsity Theater here on campus. And there's one line in it where the crew of the Starship Enterprise has gone back in time to 1987. And there's one line where, and Spock is a little bit confused because he's just come back from the dead, longer story there. And so Kirk makes an excuse for him, not really understanding what's going on. He says, well, he was at Berkeley during the free speech movement, and they did a little too much LDS at Berkeley. And it was probably 5 minutes before you could hear what was going on again in the movie, because everyone just laughed so hard at that one. Anyway, Montgomery Scott is here trying to make a deal with this guy, the president of Plexicorp, to be able to get enough plexiglass to build a tank, like an aquarium, inside of a stolen Klingon bird of prey to be able to bring back 2 humpback whales back to the future. It's a great story, but he doesn't have anything to pay for the plexiglass with, and so he's going to bargain with him to give this guy at Plexicorp the formula for transparent aluminum. And so he says, great, just show me how to do it here with a computer. This is like an Apple IIe. No, this is a Mac. This is an early Mac SE or something here. And so he's used to interacting with the computer by speaking to the computer. And so he tries to speak to it, doesn't respond. McCoy hands him the mouse, and he thinks, oh, it must be a microphone. He decides to talk into it. So sometimes our computer user is a little bit clueless, but the whole point is he's going to be our user that's interacting with the software as we look here. So we have front-end software, a long excuse for why we have Montgomery Scott as the user in this picture. So also, as we're looking at the application, we have some user of the software who interacts with front-end software. The responsibility of front-end software is to display data, to format it, to align it, to sort it, to make it look nice, to give it font and to give it color, and to organize it in such a way. And that's all the interaction with the user happens with some front-end application. And so, like the whole database approach to doing system development, say we've got some software that's non-visual, that is all about protecting the data. We've got some software that doesn't have direct access to the data, but it's all about interacting with the user. And then these two programs interact with each other. We send a request, like the front end figures out what the data wants, what the data the user wants, sends the request to the engine. The engine then is going to check to make sure that, yeah, you're allowed to ask that question. You have the authority to ask that question. It's a well-formed question and so forth. And if it passes all the checks, it gets the data and sends the data back. If it doesn't, it sends back an error message saying, sorry, I'm not going to give you what you asked for, and this is why. And so the language then here is structured query language. Show me on 0 to 5 how comfortable you are with structured query language. So 3, 4, 2, 3. Okay. So it's the industry standard language that we use for interacting with databases. The engine then either sends back the data or sends back an error. Now, what we're about to do is we're about to interact with a database engine called Microsoft SQL Server. It is probably, in terms of market share, it's either the second or the third most popular relational database management system. So Oracle is first, and then IBM and Microsoft kind of battle it out for the number 2 position. My sense is that Microsoft is now kind of solidly in that number 2 position, with IBM taking the 3rd position. And we're going to use Excel and VBA as the front end. And so the idea is the user will interact with what we're doing in Excel, and then our code in Excel will interact with the server to get the data and send it back. Okay, so high level, what we're about to do. Questions? All right. You're welcome to do this along with me or just watch, either one. I'm going to follow this next link that we have here on our page for today. And that's going to take me, let's refresh this. It's going to take me to this page, which is just a web front end to the database that we're going to interact with. So here I'm writing a pretty simple select query, select all the records from customer, I hit submit, and then from my browser, then is going to interact with, the browser doesn't interact directly with the database, it interacts with the web server that interacts with the database and then sends the data back. So here we have data, and I could specify this. I'm only interested in the ones from Utah, where state equals Utah. You can see we've got Virginia, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York. But when I run this one, we should see that I've now limited it down just to those that are here in Utah. So that's the idea. So our trick then is going to be, how can we get Excel to do what this web page is doing? Taking some, and this is pretty simple. This just says, let the user express their desires in structured query language, and it just forwards the structured query language onto the engine to be processed. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our code. I want to look at the code just to get some parameters here. So I've downloaded the work file for today, and we've got module 1 here. And this, we're going to look at this code here in a little more detail in just a moment, but I want to see that there's a couple of things we need here. One is that the server that we're connecting with is called colonialbakehouse.com. It was like when I set up my contract with this company, they said, hey, we're going to throw in a domain name for you. At the time, my kids were selling bread at the Colonial Heritage Festival, and I thought, maybe we'll make a website for it. We never did, but that's like the name of the server. And then we'll also need to know the database. So the database we'll be working with is called Red Cat. So it's like Red Cat Shoes. This is like a fictional online shoe seller. We then see that we've got a username and we've got a password that we'll be using to connect with. So we're going to come back to those in a second, but let's come into Excel. And we're going to start off first by just saying, without using VBA at all, let's just see the tools that we have built into Excel to be able to connect up and pull data from a database. It's not surprisingly, these tools are on the Data tab. So I'm going to come here to the Data tab. And then I'm going to choose Get Data. So they've got some of the most common Get Data ones here, but I'm just going to choose the Get Data dropdown. And from Database, should be no surprise that Microsoft's product is the first one here. You can get it from a Microsoft SQL Server database. You can go to an Oracle database or DB2, lots of other databases you can go to. But we're going to do the Microsoft one, primarily because the drivers for this to connect up and talk to this database are built into Windows. So we don't have to install anything else to make this happen. But it's going to need to know some information about how we're connecting. Now, to be able to do this, your Wi-Fi connection has to be on an authenticated connection. Is anyone using Guest, Wi-Fi, BYU Guest? Okay, if you're on BYU Guest, this won't work because databases, because in fact, anytime we're connecting to some kind of a web server or an internet server, whether it's a web server or it's like some kind of a file server or a database server or a mail server, there's more information that we need than you're probably used to dealing with. So let me just come to like BYU's page, byu.edu. Okay, so if I look at this, it's kind of redirected me to, there's like a couple of things that we're seeing here. So we're seeing the protocol, HTTPS. This is a secure protocol. It means that the traffic between my browser and the server is encrypted. So if someone sees the traffic going by their router, they won't be able to make any sense of it. This then is the host name that we're talking to. But we need more than a host name. This identifies a particular computer, but that computer could be running lots of different services. It could be running a web server. It has to be running a web server because we're interacting with it as a web server. It could be running that same machine could be running a mail server, a database server, a file server. And so to talk to it specifically, you've got to tell it the port that you're communicating on. Now, your browser, if you don't tell it the port, your browser assumes like a default port depending on the protocol. This is HTTPS, and so it assumes the port is 443. So like, I didn't tell it which port to talk on, and so it goes, oh, you must mean port 443. But this is how I would tell it the port. I put a colon after the host name and tell it the port. And so I'm going to copy that and go to Google so you can see it change. Google.com, I'm going to paste that in with 440, whoops. I'm going to paste, go back. See if I can go try that again. Colon 443. I copy that. Go back to Google. Paste in. You didn't put the 443. Colon 443. Enter. Uh-oh, have I forgotten the port number? That was supposed to go right there. HTTPS port number. Yeah, 443 is right. HTTPS colon 443. I must have typed something wrong before, but now we can see if I typed the colon 443 on there, it's like, great, we'll take you there. If I was to type something other, tell it, oh, let's talk about port 442, then this page is just going to sit here and spin like it's trying to get there. It hasn't gotten there because it's talking to that computer and saying, I'm trying to talk to a service on port 442. And there is no service listening on port 442. And so my browser is going to wait here for it to respond for a little while. It sent the request. It's waiting to hear back. And at some point, it's going to say, I guess it's not coming. Sorry, there's no page here. Okay, so that is just kind of a thing when you're talking about dealing with some kind of service on the internet. There's always a host name and a port involved. Well, either a host name or an IP address, because the host name is really just a numeric address that helps it get routed. I'm not sure we need all of this background, but let me just show you one more thing here. PowerShell. So I'm going to just, say there's a command in like network systems called ping, P-I-N-G. It's like a submarine. Like you're trying to find out what's out there. You send out a sound, ping, and then stuff bounces back, and you can hear the sound bounce back, and you can tell something about what's out there. And I'm going to ping byu.edu. And I'm just asking, are you there? And the first thing it's going to do is going to say, listen, I don't know what byu.edu is, but like to talk to a machine, I need the address. So the first thing that has to happen is it uses DNS, domain name server. It talks to a domain name server and it says, hey, what's the IP address for byu.edu? It then says, that's the address. And that's actually where the communication happens with that number. So anyway, whenever you're talking to a server, you got to have the IP address, which could be a host name that will get resolved to an IP address, and you have to have the port. So we'll be talking to a particular SQL server on a particular port here. So what was our server? colonialbakehouse.com. Our database was Redcat. Here's where I would specify the port. I think I would do comma 1433, which is the default port for talking to a Microsoft SQL server. So just like talking to an HTTPS server, the default is port 443. The default for SQL Server is 1433. I'm going to leave that off because it is the default port. And I'm going to say OK. Server database, SQL Server database. Okay, so now it's saying, great, how do you want to actually be authenticated on that? I think at this point it is successfully connected. Is there anyone who's trying to do this example along with and didn't get here? Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm not going to connect to my Windows account. This is going to try to like use how I'm currently logged into Windows. Well, that database server out there in the cloud has no idea who my current account is. But I do know the credentials for one database. And what was it? Redcat user? Now I don't remember. Yeah, Redcat user and then Thomas 1775. Select the level at which to apply these settings. And I guess if I had like multiple databases running on that same host, I could do something different, but I'll just use the default here. And I'll choose connect. And so now we're unable to connect to the data source using an encrypted connection. To access using unencrypted, click OK, that's fine. So now Excel is trying to talk to that database server in the cloud with the credentials I specified, and it has succeeded connecting to it because now it's saying, hey, there's lots of things you could choose from over here. And I think I was just interested in the customer table. So I'll select the customer table here, and it's saying, hey, this is what we're going to bring in. I'll say, great, load that data. And it will now bring that data in, and this is the data that's on that database. Now, this data doesn't change. It's not actually a company out there. It's just sample data. But if this data changed, I would be able to say refresh that, and it would send the request back out. It's like a web query, but this is a database query. It says, hey, what's the data currently like out there? And it brings it in. So at this point, we're actually using Excel as a front end to that database server in the cloud, and we've specified the information that we need for it to communicate it, and it knows how to communicate with it. Pretty good. Questions on what we've done so far? So now what I'd like to do is accomplish this same thing, but to do it with VBA. So rather than having the user go through the tools in here to bring the data in, we'll do it with VBA. And the reason is that it may be that we don't even really want to show the data onto a sheet. We want to connect to that data, bring it into VBA, figure out what to do with it, and then do something different. So like actually bringing that whole data in here may not be what we're after. But if we're using the tools that are just built into Excel, that's the one way I get at the data, is just bring the data in. So let's see how to do this with VBA. Okay, so I've given you some code to start with. So first thing that we're going to have to realize is that we're going to be using objects. We're going to be creating objects that are not native to Excel. And so have we created objects? Yeah, we've created some objects. We've created a collection object from scratch. What else have we created? We've created references to like sheets and workbooks and ranges. We've made object variables for those, but it's not limited. Like what we can do with Excel is not, with VBA is not just limited to what's in Excel. There are lots of other objects that we could create. And these are from a set of objects called the Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects Library. And so to be able to have access to these data types, we need to get a reference to the ADODB library. So if we're trying to make an object that's like native to Excel, it's just available. But there are like so many possible extensions that Excel doesn't make them all available. It depends on what you have on your machine. Now, every Windows machine has these objects because it's just part of the Windows operating system. But here's how we tell VBA that they're available. Here in my VBA editor, I'm going to choose Tools and then References. And you're going to get a sense for just how many additional objects we could be creating and manipulating in VBA. So it's giving us the ones that we already have checked. So Visual Basic for applications, check. Like the objects to work with all of Microsoft. Well, this is just all of Excel. Here's all of Microsoft Office. So we could directly interact with like Word and PowerPoint from VBA without having to do anything additional because those are checked by default. Olay automation, object linking and embedding. That was something that was really fancy, like in the 1990s, that no one does anymore. Maybe some people do. I certainly don't. So we got to go find this one, and you're going to see there are lots of these. I'm scrolling down and just barely got out of the A's. We're in the C's. There's lots of them. I'm after the one. It's called the Microsoft ActiveX. What was it called? ActiveX Data Access Objects. Microsoft ActiveX Data Access Objects. And there's several different versions. What we're doing in class today is so simple that any of these would work, but I'm going to choose the most recent one that's on this machine, and that's 6.1. It's not enough to click on it to select it and turn it blue. You have to check the check mark next to it. And that is going to say, all right, Visual Basic, interpreter. Now, when someone tries to refer to a particular set of objects, those are ones they're allowed to create references to. And so that will allow me to create these two objects. ADODB stands for ActiveX Data Objects Database. And we're creating a connection object in that space and a record set. So a connection says, hey, we're going to get ourselves connected to a server. It's all the information we need to connect to a server. And the record set is, once I'm connected to that database server, how do I specify the set of records that I want to bring back? So there are two different objects for that. I've got two string variables here. CS just is for a connection string, which is how we tell VBA like the information about the database we're working with. This says the driver to use is Microsoft SQL Server. And again, that driver, that database driver, is what has to be installed for us to be able to talk to that engine. That driver is built into Windows. It's available everywhere. If I wanted to connect to an Oracle driver and change this to Oracle here, I would have to go through a process to install the Oracle driver on this machine to be able to make the connection. The database then is Red Cat and the server is Colonial Bakehouse. That's the same information that we had to specify to connect just to read the data in. So that's the connection string. It's just a string of characters that my open method of my connection object, right? Here's CN, which is a reference to the database connection object. The open method of that object says, give me a connection string, and I'll figure out how to talk to that database. Give me a username and a password, and we'll authenticate there at that database. The SQL then is just a structured query language that I'm trying to execute. Select everything from the customer table. Using that connection then, this will open the connection, but it doesn't bring back any data. It just gets me connected onto that database. I will then say I want to open a record set. So RS object variable is my record set object. And I'm going to call the open method of the record set, send it the structured query language, and send it the connection to execute that structured query language. And if that works, I will have the connection of, I will have the set of access to the set of records. Now, I'm not doing anything with it. I'm opening it, and then I'm closing the record set and closing the connection. So when I run this, I should expect not to see anything happen, including not to see an error. If I don't see an error here, it means these statements were successful. That's good. All right. So, and again, you'll have to be on an authenticated connection. Oh, that's why I went down the whole port, to explain to you that we need the port. It's because if you're just connected on like as a guest, BYU guest Wi-Fi, you're saying, we don't know who you are. Do you even have to like give an email address or something when you log in as guest? I don't know. Just log in as guest. What are we going to let you do? We're not going to let you do much. We'll let you check the internet. We might let you check your email apart from just going to like a website to check your email. And that's about it. You want to do something more like talk to a database server, you're going to have to authenticate so we know who you are. And it does that by limiting what port you're allowed to communicate on. So when you're on that BYU Wi-Fi, this thing will let you talk on port 443, encrypted traffic, port 80, unencrypted web traffic, port 25, which is like email traffic, and that's about it. It will not route port 1433 traffic. So when we try to talk to that database server from VBA and you are on that guest network, the request would get made, like your VBA would make the request, it would get to the first router, and that first router at BYU guest Wi-Fi is going to go, no. And it won't even respond. It just doesn't route the traffic. So as far as your application is concerned, you sent the request out there and it didn't respond. It's exactly the same thing as the computer being down or non-existent. So that's kind of why it works differently on different networks, is because if you're not authenticated, BYU is saying, we'll let you do a very limited set of things here. And talking to a SQL server is not one of them. Okay. If you would, just show me on a scale of 0 to 5 how edifying you thought the discussion of ports was and network traffic here. 5 was like, that was really interesting. I'm glad I know that. I didn't know that before. 1 is like, I already totally knew that, or I don't care to know that. It's like either one of those. Okay, so some of you are at 4s and 5s, others kind of all over 2s and 3s. Okay, that's helpful for me. Thank you. Okay, so now let's do something with the data. So between where I've opened the record set and where I'm closing that record set, I want to do something with it. All right, so let's do this. Let me just kind of print off one value to my immediate window. And so like, here's the simplest way to do that, debug.print. And I will print off my record set, RS, and the record set then has a property that is the fields that are in that record set. So these are the columns in the database. And I can refer to those either by their name, like many collections, either by their name or their ordinal position. But unlike collections in VBA that start numbering at 1, this collection starts numbering at 0. So if I just say print the number 0 field, and print, by the way, the name of that, or not the name, but the value of that field, then that should just print whatever the first record has in its first column. I'm expecting to see a 12 there. So I'll run this and it prints that 12. Instead of doing the number, I should be able to do the name of a field. I'll run that one and that should give me James. Interesting. I didn't expect it to show both. And I don't think maybe it didn't. Maybe it just wrote next to it. Yeah. So I think I already just had the cursor up there next to it and wrote next to it. So the interesting thing is that, I mean, I'm referring to the fields of the whole record set, but it's only giving me a single value. And that's because this field's property holds the values for one record. So if I want to put into that fields collection the values from the next record, I have to tell the record set to move to the next record. So you just do this. The record set is RS. It has a method called move next. And that will just move to the next record. And if I was to print that same line again, it should now give me the first name of my next record. So this should print James and then Frederick. So even though this is a connection to the whole record set, it really only has access to information about one record at a time. And by moving to a specified record, that's how I get to that data. And that's good because database tables are often huge, like way bigger. You wouldn't want to try to load the whole table into memory because your computer doesn't have enough memory. These tables could be terabytes in size, even bigger. And so this is nice because this allows us to say, yeah, we can get access to that table. We can get access to all the data in the table by going after it one record at a time. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of duplicate this. So I'd like to go ahead and like insert a sheet and put that data onto the sheet. So let's go ahead and get ourselves a sheet object. So dim S as a worksheet. And we'll set S equal to a new worksheets.add. And now instead of printing this information, I would like to write it out to a cell. So we probably should keep track of the row that we're talking about. So let me dim R as a long. And I'm going to start R equal to 2. R equals 2. Because we're going to put the names here onto the first row. But now, instead of doing a print on this, I'm going to say s.cells, row number R, column number 1 is going to be equal to my field number 0. In fact, I'm not going to worry about doing the second one. Let's just kind of get the first one. Do 3 of these before I make them into a loop. Same row, different next column over. Next column over would be next field over. So that should give me a customer ID, a first name, and a last name into that row 2 of my worksheet. I'm going to create a new worksheet and we'll show it. Let's see if that does it. I'll run that. There's good. I've got the sheet 2 now has been created and it's put that record on there. So let me see if I can get, let's just make a loop that will do the whole, write out the whole record. So I'll need another variable for this. I'll call this X, and X as an integer. And we'll put this into a loop for X equals 0 to the count. We can do this. We'll do for X equals 1 to rs.fields dot count. Next, get rid of my other ones here, but I can see I need this one to go 1, 2, 3. This one to go 0, 1, 2. So this will be X, and this will be X minus 1. And that should now create a new sheet and put the whole first record across. I'm on sheet 3 now, and yeah, looks like it did. Get information from that whole first record. So far, so good. Kind of bringing in some of the stuff we've learned about loops together and applying it to databases. So now, maybe even before we do this, let's go ahead and get our field names here. The field names is going to be exactly the same, but instead of putting out the value, I'm just going to do a different property because it has a name property. So maybe even before I set R equal to 2, I'm going to come and duplicate this loop. And instead of writing it out to row number R, I'm going to write it out to row number 1, the very first row. And I'm going to write not the value, but I'm going to write the name. So here I wrote all the values out on row 2. Now I'm saying just write the names onto row 1. And I brought that before I did my data. Could do it afterwards, but I'm doing it before. So this one is fixed to look at row number 1, whereas this one is going to change as R changes. This one's looking at the name, bringing the name off, and this is bringing off the value. So now I get the names of the data, and then plus I'm bringing in the values of the data. Excellent. How are we doing so far, folks? Any questions? All right, our next step here is going to be, let's go ahead and make it bring all of the records back. So I want to do this over and over again, incrementing R. So after the next, let me go ahead and say R equals R plus 1. And I'm going to wrap this inside of a do loop. So we get a do, and a loop. Whoops, I want my move next to be inside the loop. Have these in. And this will now go and get all the data, and it will stop when it's done with the data. Why does it stop? Because it'll have an error. It's going to try to move past the end. I'd like to not have an error. Good news, there is a property called EOF of my record set. Do until rs.eof, stands for end of file. And what happens is the end of file is, the property is false when you first start, as long as there's a record there. And then when you ask for the next record, if there's a record to get, when you say move next, it's so great, here's the next record. And it doesn't change the end of file property. Eventually, you've read the last record. End of file property is still true. You ask for the next record, move next, and there's no other record. That's when it sets the end of file property to true. And so in this case, I'm definitely want my condition at the top, because based on the query that I run, if there's no data that comes back, end of file will be true. Like if it comes back and it's a blank empty set, end of file is true already. And so I don't want to try to print these things out. I'm okay putting the headers out, but no data. Otherwise, I want to just keep running until I run out of data. So when I read, I've got the first record, it prints out the first record. Move next, I got the next record. It loops, prints out the next record. I get the last record. I move next to the last record. I loop around. RSEOF is still false. It prints the last record. I say move next again. It moves past the last record. Having just printed the last record, it moves past the last record and sets EOF to true. We get up to the top and it goes, oh, EOF is now true. We're done with the loop. So this should give me a sheet and bring all the data on. And how many records are there? 4,000 records or so. 4,000 records, a lot of data. It's a little drop. It's a tiny little drop of data. Okay. Questions? So have I duplicated so far what my tool did when I brought in the customer sheet? Looks like I've got the same data here, but what else does that tool do? It makes this into a table. So you may remember, like in Excel, there's a thing called the table. If I come to the Insert tab, I can like take some data and make it into a table. So I'd like to do that. I'd like to have my code do that as well. But let me record I don't know how to do that. So let me record myself doing. So on my developer tab, record macro. Macro 1, I think that's a great name. I'm just going to try to get the code that it generates, and I'll move it over to my other code. So say okay. I'll just choose insert table. My table, that's where it is. That looks good. Has a header. Perfect. I'll say okay. I don't know what that is, but not now. This looks pretty good, except that my data is kind of being trimmed off here, not quite showing. So I'm just going to select all of my cells and double click the boundary between two cells, and that should make it resize. And that'll record the resizing as well. and then I'll stop recording. Now, if I can make my code do that, this will be doing just the same thing here. It's got a different color, but in terms of functionality, that's brought in the same data. Now, why does this look a little different? Oh, interesting. We'll probably want to deal with this postal code issue as well. What's it doing here for postal code? What's the difference? Yeah, this one, it realizes to treat it as a string. Whereas mine, when I write this 03427 into the cell, it goes, oh, I know 034, or what is it? 0348. Was it really? 03427. Don't think it should have rounded it. I just read it wrong. It's 03748. Yeah, 03748. It gets rid of the 0 at the beginning because when you store it as a number, like every number is, it's just a number. And there's no difference between a number with a 0 in front of it and just a number without the 0, or 3 zeros or 10 zeros in front of it. And so if I'm recording it as a number, there's no way to keep track of those values before. So we'll want to do something to keep track of that number. But let's go ahead and get our table showing, and let's get the things, the cells spread out, and then we'll see if we can deal with that number issue. All right. So let me look at the code that got recorded. Cut copy mode false. That's just taking me out of cut copy mode. Oh, here it is, list objects.add. So the active sheets list objects.add, and it's giving it a name. No, we need to have that broken onto the next line. Why did it call it table 2? My guess is this one was called table 1. Come to table design. This one's called customer. Maybe it spent the name. That's my only other one. Maybe it spent table 1's name. I don't know. Anyway, it's given it a name of table 2. Come to table design. There's table 2 right there. All right. And then here is the auto fit. All the cells select, and then all the cells auto fit. So I'm going to go ahead and bring these 3 lines over and bring them into my module 1 code. So after I brought the data in, and just to kind of emphasize that these can be done after I've closed the connection, like by the time I've printed the data out, I don't need the connection anymore. So I'll put these things after the connection. But instead of active sheets list objects.add, I'm just going to do S. That's the sheet that I created. And instead of like this actually makes the list object, and then because it returns a reference to that list object, I can use the name property and change the name of it. I don't want to do that. I don't think I can have 2 tables called table 2. I'm not sure that I'm always going to just be selecting all the records from, so I don't want to try to infer it from the SQL. So I think I'm just going to get rid of the .name equals and let it default to whatever it does. I mean, Excel is going to default a value for me, and I'll just leave it as it is. Now, if I leave this line, I'll say, hey, you got an error. Slow down, cowboy. What's the problem? Someone tell me what's the error. This is a frustrating error. How I wish this wasn't an error. It doesn't really have to be an error, but it is. Go ahead.
Does it actually have things with C's on the method, even though we aren't performing it?
That's so close. It's because this is returning something. But because it's returning something, like the parentheses say, yeah, return the value. And we're not doing anything with the return value. And so we've got to tell it, hey, I'm not doing anything with the return value. In fact, it may even tell it not to return a value. Probably what it does. Without the parentheses, it says don't return a value. And then it can be a statement by itself. So if we were doing something with a return value, what were we doing before? We were just referring to a property of that returned object. But if we're not doing anything with return value, no parentheses. I don't need to select the cells because this is referring to the cells. Normally, you're used to seeing like cells, 1, 2, a particular cell. Well, if I say the cells method without indicating what the cells are, this is all the cells on the worksheet. And so that sounds great. But I'm going to make sure that I'm talking about the sheet I just created. So s.cells.autofit. So that should pull the data in, and it should now kind of do this full example. Let me go ahead and delete all of these off, these extra ones off here, just so we can see it change. So now it's brought the data in, formatted it, spaced it. It looks fantastic. All except the little pesky problem here with postal code. All right. Let's suppose, for the next part of this discussion, that you got this far, and now you're thinking, I got to deal with that postal code. How are we going to track this down? How are we going to figure out how to deal with this? Let's just, for right now, let's say we're gonna treat postal code special. Like we're going to say, we know this is the one that we have to deal with, so we're going to treat it. We're not going to try to infer whether we should treat it. We're going to treat column number, column letter G. We want to treat this one differently. So how can I make it so that when I put that value there, it doesn't automatically convert it into a number? There's a couple of ways, and I wonder if you know what one of them is. Just like in Excel, how would you do it? No VBA involved.
Then you just like select the column and go to general and say, make this like general instead of a number.
Probably make it text. If I tell it to be text, let's see if that works. You just come here in column J and let me set the format of this to be text. And now let's see what happens if I type in 00123455. Yeah, it keeps it from converting data that's entered into a number if it's set up as text. Okay, so on our first step here, let's just do that for column G. I think I want to record myself doing it because I'm not entirely sure how to do it. So record a macro. That looks great. On home, change it to text. Stop recording. And let's go take a look and see what it did. That looks pretty easy. Selection, number format, at. All right, and when should I do that? Where in my code should I do that? Someone give me a thought. That sounds like a scary question to answer because there's so many places that you could put it, Professor Allen. So let's go down to it. We'll make this a true or false. It would be a good idea to put it here, true or false. Why false? Yeah, at that point, I've already put the data onto the sheet. Excel has already done the conversion in the process. So it means it's got to go sometime before we do this. And so I think I want to do it. Why don't we do it? I don't think it worries about I'm not worried about the fields here. It's the field names. I'm going to put it right here. I'll put the code in here. Instead of selection number format, this is going to be s.columns. And then what column was it? G. So that's seventh column. 7. Number format is at. Let's give it a shot and see if that does it. Yeah, looks like we got that now set that way. And does it actually show those as the little green things on my other one, customer? It doesn't. Oh, that's going to be another trick. And this is one I've never done before. How do we get rid of that little message there? What even is that thing called? Does anyone know what that's called? Error checking, ignore error. VBA, ignore error. Let's find out how to do that. Oh, I could probably just record myself doing it. Developer, record macro. Macro 3. Ignore error. Oh, delightful. Stop recording. Did it record something? No, not recordable. Couldn't record it. So what's our next bet? Next best bet? Google or ChatGPT. Try it. Someone try it in ChatGPT. I'm going to try to Google it first. What would it be? It would be VBA. Ignore error in cell. How can I ignore the green triangle error in the range? Forget the question. What does the answer say? Dot errors, range dot errors doesn't seem to work. That's a great answer. Tell us what doesn't work. After a bit of experimentation, I found you can manually set the range of cells, click the little pop-up that appears, that doesn't appear to have a VBA equivalent. Did ChatGPT do any help? Open event that does it. My error check. That's harder than I want to try to tackle here in class. So maybe we'll come back and look at that at the end, especially if someone figures out how to do it for me. All right. That's the first time that I recorded something in class that didn't record, like in a long time. Earlier in the days of Excel, there were lots of things that didn't record. Like early on, you make a chart, didn't record anything. That was terrible. This is one they still haven't built out. Maybe they never will. All right. So let's leave the errors for now. Oh, so what I'd like to do is I would like to see if I can, rather than having to know which ones to treat as text, I wonder if I can infer which ones to treat as text. So to do that, I want to poke around a little bit on my record set object. So let me go ahead and put a breakpoint right here, right before I do this. Stop. Run my code to there. So now let me look at rs.fields. See what we have to do. So I want item number 1 dot, what do we have here? Actual size, attributes, data format. That's interesting. But this one looks better to me, type. Let me print that type out. That's type 202. That's not that helpful. But let's look at number 0, and that's number 3. So these types probably there's probably some instructions somewhere that's going to tell me what those field types are. But let me look at the other one that looked good. Data format. What is this? It seemed to like data format. Type may be my best one. Attributes, data format, define, number, decision properties, status. Type. Okay, so this is record set object, field type, enumeration. Field type for the DAO. DAO is data access objects, which is different than ActiveX data objects. Let's try this one. Well, this looks encouraging. What was one of them? Did we get 202? Oh yeah, 202. Null terminated Unicode character string. So 202 is a string. So we could look at these and we could tell, like, if there's several of these types that are a string, those are the ones we want to make into data. So it looks like 200, 202, integers, string 203, long string 201, long binary value 205. Looks like 200 to 201 we would want. Is that right? Oh, it's probably no coincidence, or to 202. Probably no coincidence that they're all grouped together. Okay, let's do that. So here's what I'm going to do. In here where I'm looping across those fields, I'm going to say if something, then what am I going to do? I'm going to say column sub x equals this format. Anything that's a string type, I'm going to do that. Column sub X, because we're writing it out to that column. So we're going to address the format of that column. And all I want to do is, if my field's type is greater than 199 and my field's type is less than 204, I think 203 was the biggest one that I saw, then we're going to set that whole column's number format to that. So rather than having this hard-coded at 7 that's specific to this data set, this should now make it that I can look at the data set and any of those string types that are in that range should automatically convert those into those columns being formatted to be strings. I'm going to run it and run it again and see if it does it. Didn't like something. Oh, because it's name. This is supposed to be type. That's automatically then made that into a text type, and probably the rest of these. The only one that's probably not a text is customer. Let's see if that's true, or customer ID. So text, 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 text. And that first one, though, is still general. So we didn't adjust that one, but it looked at the data type on the rest of these columns, made them into text, so we don't have that problem of dealing with the numbers. Okay, so this gives us access to these records one record at a time. One record at a time and one field at a time, right? I can kind of work through my data and go back and forth. Let's see about how long it takes to run this. I'm going to run this and see how long it takes before it turns blue. 1,000, 2, 1,000. It's about a second, maybe not quite 2 seconds. And I'm just wondering if we can speed that up. And the answer is yes. Let me show you kind of another shortcut here. I'm going to copy my whole sub procedure here, DB1, paste it in, and then I'll rename this to DB2. My whole connection is going to come in here the same way. I'm going to go ahead and leave this part in. Let me get rid of this. I'm not sure if I need this or not. I'm going to get rid of where I'm doing the types, and then I'll get rid of where I'm running the data out as well. So now all I'm doing is putting on the labels, the column names, but I'm not doing anything with the data. And now we're going to see that there's actually a property of the range that's meant for dealing with data sets, record sets. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say s dot range A2. Let's just look at the properties that are available here. I'm going to come down to where it says copy. And look at that. There's a method called copy from record set. Like I can speak to a cell and say copy data from a record set. So I'm going to take that property. It's a method, and so it wants to know what record set to copy from. So I'm just going to tell it the record set we just opened, RS. This gets the data, not the headers, or not the column headings. So I still need to put this to put those column headings in. But that should now say, just take the data from that record set and drop it starting in A2. Close the record set in the connection, build the list object. Let's see how long this one takes to run. 1,001. Oh, that's faster. There was definitely less delay there. So if I really do need from VBA just to bring the data in, I don't have to process row by row, column by column. There's a method that just says plop it in there. And whatever they're doing it faster than I can do it with VBA, going row and like writing each cell. So that's available as well. Okay, questions on what we've seen so far? So this is the kind of the basic structure of what do we need to do to be able to connect up to a database, communicate with that database, and manipulate that in VBA. When we get together next time, we're going to say, instead of just asking for data from the database, we are going to change the data in the database. So we'll be both inserting records. I think that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on inserting records, but updating and deleting records is really similar as well. We may see that, we may not, but I definitely need to show you how to insert records because that's what you have to do on the project that covers this. Read all that data without crime statistics off of the worksheets and insert one record at a time into the database. Okay, let's call that good for today. Thanks for coming. I will see you next Monday. Class dismissed. You're too kind.